In a city that venerates ivory, tower intellect, Mira, a modest seamstress who measures life in thread and sunlight, stumbles into a live demonstration where, and whom possible, math problem has stumped the nation. When she solves it in 47 electric seconds with a gesture as ordinary as folding cloth, the academic world fractures. Some call it a fluke, others a scandal. The story follows Mira's shock and quiet dignity, the fury and curiosity of a retired professor who wants to prove the truth, and the institutional resistance determined to keep the problem. And Mira's revelation. Inside their old equations, against a backdrop of televised spectacle, whispered betrayals, and the smell of coffee and machine oil, the narrative traces themes of belonging, gatekeeping, courage, and redemption. It is cinematic, intimate, and human, a portrait of how genius can look like humility, and how a single unexpected answer can expose the brittle architecture of prestige. Mira's hands remembered numbers the way her skin remembered seams. Even when she was not working, the tips of her fingers twitched with the memory of division. The neat incisions of pin to fabric. The way a dart echoed a parabola. The precise half-inch she nicked from the hem of a dress and tucked into invisible geometry. In the small apartment above the tailor's shop, morning light came in soft and square, catching on her thimble like a tiny moon. Outside, the city had the slow breath of a market opening. Fruit stalls arranging oranges in diminishing circles, a bus coughing out a cloud of things. People. Wait, a boy calling the price of sugar as if it were a theorem to be proven. Mira had no papers to frame on her wall. No degrees curled in laminated corners. Her life was a ledger of receipts, tenderly folded, and the consistent rhythm of machines humming. The men at the institute, the ones who spoke of proofs like liturgy, would have had trouble seeing anything like a mind in her workbench of pins. They were taught, years ago, that brilliance resides in rooms with too many books and not enough sunlight. The Institute's annual challenge had become less a scholarly contest than a festival, a ritual of prestige. For decades, it had advertised a single problem as unsolved and impossible, a piece of high-minded theater that drew cameras and donors and op-eds. The problem lived in the middle of their marble atrium, like a stained trophy, a glass display case with a black cube inside, accompanied by the printed equations and a smug line of text reminding the public that some questions are unanswerable, at least by the usual minds. That morning, Mira had been scheduled to hang new curtains in the atrium. The Institute had hired her mother's old tailoring business for the gala. The task was practical and light, make the marble less echoing, add warmth to the camera's cold angles. The director, Dean Raines, had insisted on the best linen, an irony that suited him. He liked things that looked expensive and portable. 47 seconds. Her friend Nadia joked as they carried bolts of cloth up the stair. Nadia had come with Mira as a helper, though her primary role was cheerfulness and a thermos of thick coffee. If you can do anything in 47 seconds, it's make a pot of tea. Mira smiled, fingernails catching on fabric. 47 seconds is nothing. It's half a song. They arrived to a room that smelled of wax and anticipation. Volunteers arranged chairs in radial patterns. Cameras found their prime angles, and a cluster of men in suits moved with the smug certainty of those who had never been told to patch a sleeve at midnight. The impossible problem sat on the presentation table with a spotlight that made its formulas look sacred. A television crew tested angles. TV presenters practiced their astonished faces. A banner stretched across the atrium read, "The I'm PZBLE Puro BLEM, Cell VAT, Psi Z The Ward Easiness Parisi." Mira should have been invisible. That had been the rhythm of her life, blend into hymns, attend to the margins, make things fit so the important things could continue their important displays. But the world is always crueler than choreography allows. A curtain caught on a loudspeaker, the batch of volunteers faltered, and in a small human cascade. The presenter's shoe snagged. An assistant dropped a folder. A vacuum opened in the front rows. Cameras, bored for warm bodies to lens, found Mira folding the linen like it had to be kept alive. "Can you?" Dean Raines asked before. He remembered he shouldn't ask anyone below him anything but his name. But he had a problem with his script. He needed a moment of human warmth. He needed someone in the shot to explain the color of the curtains. He needed a person whose hands could move the fabric with something like reverence. Mira nodded. It was not a yes so much as a default to movement. Nadia's grin pushed her forward. "If you'd like to join the panel, we can put you in the segment," the presenter suggested brightly, as if this were charity. Mira folded the linen. Her hands were careful, almost secretive. The camera panned to include the work of the seamstress and the not quite visible life behind it. The studio lights turned the threads into silver. "And here at the Institute," the presenter said, voice syrupy, "we are gathered to discuss a puzzle that has tormented mathematicians for a generation. For those who don't know, we've posted the problem here publicly. Any mind, any background, may attempt it. Our patrons hope, perhaps vainly, that the impossible will be solved." The challenge was theatrical, a two-page problem about tiling a plane within a periodic shape. In simpler words, without repetition, can you tile an infinite floor with a single irregular tile and no pattern? The math community bottled their breath with these sorts of problems. Some boasted that the problem revealed the aesthetic limits of logic. Newspapers loved the romantic impossibility of it all. Mira listened as the presenter read the dense paragraph aloud. Her fingers continued their precise work. The sewing machine hummed in the background like a metronome of patience. People leaned forward in their seats and practiced their shocked faces in the reflection of the broadcast monitors. Then Elias Hargrove arrived. He was not young. He had the kind of silver hair that seemed to remember other epochs, a face that the Institute had shown in 100 plaques. A living archive of brilliance. Elias was a retired professor who had once led a breakthrough in combinatorial topology and then quit the world of glittering conferences for a small office with a view of the river. Retirement had not lessened his hunger, it had only made him more humane. He came with a small, battered notebook, the edges of his pages soft as if held by many hands, and with him came an honesty that made people uncomfortable. He wandered the atrium with a patience older than anyone's ambition and sat on the edge of a folding chair, choosing the place where the light fell gently across his lap. He watched Mira as she folded the linen and felt something like an old instrument tuning itself. There was a kindness in his eyes that had been honed by the years of watching students break or be built. "You know," he said softly as he sat next to her, "most of us get so theatrical about impossibility that we forget impossibility is just another word for not yet understood." Mira blinked. She had expected disinterest or a lecture about work ethic. Instead, Elias spoke the language of patience. "You used to teach here?" she asked, surprised by the wish in her voice. "Used to," he said. "I'm still here in the corners. The official plaque says nothing about corners. They prefer the light." A miscue elsewhere jolted the event back into motion. Cameras trained on the black cube, and the presenter smiled big enough to make teeth ache. The director cued the segment, an on-air challenge to the public live with a clock ticking. 47 seconds. Nadia muttered again, half-chant. Mira ran her thumb over the hem. The problem on the table had a diagram that resembled a patchwork of strange tiles, each with angles that refused easy repetition. It looked, to most eyes, like a child's college. To a pair of seamstress hands, it looked like patterned pieces the shapes of sleeves, hats, uncut collars. The idea arrived like a found stitch. It was not a flash of genius so much as the slow recognition that sometimes what mathematics calls tiling is exactly what a tailor does every day. Make shapes fit without waste. A thought that had been dormant in the way her hands folded cloth unfurled into something sharp. She saw, suddenly, not an infinite plane, but a finite set of rules. A way to reflect and rotate a tile such that the local constraints folded into a global order. Her breath went quiet. Elias watched the small flush of focus cross her face. He did not know what she had seen, but he recognized the way the world narrowed when the mind touched a clean truth. He leaned in, silent. On the monitors, a countdown started. The presenter announced that the Institute would offer a live demonstrations. Anyone who could create a non-repetitive tiling for a small patch of floor, a test case, not the infinite, would prove a concept and the world would clap. The Institute's board of trustees would convene to discuss award recognition. That's a trick, Dean Raines whispered as if to himself. Publicity. A stunt. Mira stood. She was no longer just fabric and light. Her heartbeat was a steady drum. She walked to the table as cameras oriented like predatory birds. The presenter smiled and waved as if to say, "Bring me a spectacle." "Would you like to try?" he asked without irony. Elias's voice cut across the hums. "Let her." The audience rotated like a wheel on its axis. In the first row, a row of young interns took the moment to elevate their own online profiles, angling phones for content. In the second row sat conservative donors, faces like coins. Behind them, a hand of mathematicians stirred, some skeptical, some genuinely curious. Mira moved with a slow economy. The Institute provided wooden tiles for the demonstration, 10 irregular shapes, each painted with dull varnish. She thought of cardboard templates, of muslin underlay, of the way she matched patterns to avoid seams. Her fingers touched the tiles like old friends. The official clock began. Someone counted down in the corner of the screen. 60-50, 9-50. For reasons she couldn't name, she let the numbers land in her chest like pebbles. 47. The number was a small bell inside her ribcage. She arranged the first tile by reflecting it once. Then she rotated another, cutting a slice of possibility. Her movements were small, precise, a tuck, a matching of angles, the way a collar bends into a lapel. She worked not with proof, but with intuition transformed into practice, a local rule. Enforced with a reflection, created a forced alignment beyond the small patch. By the time the seconds accumulated, the tiled patch had unfolded into a design that was neither periodic nor chaotic. It had an order that made its own music, motifs that repeated only in restricted sequences and never in monotonous cycle. Her final tile slid into place, an almost polite click, and the entire room inhaled as if the breath had been held by a single body. 47 seconds. Silence fell, the kind of silence that has a weight to it. Then, the presenter, who had practiced astonishment for years, could only stammer. The cameras took in Elias first, an old man in a cheap suit and luminous hair. He had a small, almost private smile. On the monitor, the tiled patch looked singular and modest and revolutionary all at once. Some students clapped instinctively, the sound a small, immediate thing. The director told the cameras to stay wide, broadcasting this all over the city. Dean Raines' face hardened into a line of business. "It's evidence," he said loudly, trying to take command. "But it's only a construction for a finite patch. It does not generalize, does it?" A woman from the faculty demanded, skeptical, hair pinched into geometry. "We need a formal proof." Mira wiped her hands on the hem of the linen, the motion habitual. She felt suddenly small, as if the light and the cameras were larger than the body they framed. She wanted to go back to the sewing machine, to rhythm, but Elias stood and moved to the podium before anyone could think to stop him. "What she produced is a witness," he said. The word lodged in the room like a pebble. "A witness that the intended global constraints can be satisfied locally. It's not a full proof yet, but it reveals a construction pattern that deserves scrutiny. The faculty murmured. There was a mix of envy and curiosity. Some faces turned the way a mall turns to follow a parade float. "What's your name?" the presenter asked, like an out-of-practice adult needing permission to ask a child. "Mira," she said. "Mira Rahman." The name carried no titles. It had the plain music of a shopkeeper's ledger. It was not inscribed in ivory frames. The first shock rippled outward as a public story. Cameras chased her, websites wrote headlines. On the morning talk shows, pundits argued about the optics. She was thrust through the narrow opening between suspicion and wonder. Some said it was a fluke. Others, the internet's louder cohorts, shouted about inclusivity and the cruelty of gatekeeping. The institute, which had carefully staged the event for good optics, suddenly found itself at the center of a storm it had not invited. Mira wanted to hide. She wanted the warm, known hum of cotton and thread. Instead, she walked into a frenzy. People wanted her solution, the board, the media, the math blogs that published open letters in fonts large enough to be their own arguments. Some accused her of being a stunt. Some accused the institute of planning her, as if a seamstress could not come by geometry honestly. Elias, however, insisted on the truth of curiosity. "We will not make her a curiosity in a display case," he told a board meeting behind closed doors. The board had bristled. A trustee, a man all neck and ledger, had said, "Must protect the problem's integrity." By that, he meant protect the narrative of the institute as a gatekeeper. Mira, in quiet corners of the atrium, watched the formal world attempt to domesticate her. She did not belong to their language. It made everything harder. The cameras wanted a hero and a backstory crafted to emotion, but Mira felt like a hand that had been asked to speak. She kept working. In the slow hours when the cameras had gone and the institute smelled of diminishing flowers, she sat with Elias in a room that smelled like old paper and river water and told him how she had seen the tile as pattern. She spoke in images, the way collars nested, the way a sleeve's curve demanded a mirrored shape on the other side. It was a seamstress's lexicon translated into topology. "You treat geometry like clothing," Elias said, delight in his voice. "You look at seams and fittings. That's how new ideas start, from an unfamiliar translation." "But they say I am not trained," Mira said, a thin protest. "They keep asking me for proofs." "They ask because they need the public paper trail," Elias said. "But they also ask because they are afraid of what it means if someone without their shields finds a way in. If a person like you can solve this with a practiced hand, then perhaps their story of exclusivity is a fiction." That word, fiction, settled in Mira like a small bruise. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She wanted a life where her hands could move and be enough. The institute assigned a panel to analyze her construction. It was a strange kind of scrutiny, men and women with tidy hair and the capacity to make any conversation a battle. There were graduate students who looked as if the world had opened like a textbook for them and had no place for a seamstress intuition. There were cameras. There were notebooks being filled with formulas that did not yet touch Mira's simple sketch. It was in the hum of those meetings that Mira learned about claim and counterclaim. Dean Rains spoke with the clarity of someone who had read a manual on preserving reputations. "We must be careful," he said. "A construction for a patch is not a proof for infinite tiling. We cannot validate her on spectacle alone. Then validate it with rigor." Elias said, "Bring in the proof. Let the papers read it. But don't let rigor be an excuse for gatekeeping." The argument on procedural grounds was tedious and, to Mira, oddly theatrical. She had made a patch that suggested a principle. The faculty wanted a sequence of lemmas. She wanted someone to listen to the argument she had made with her hands and see that it could be extended. So she worked. She turned to the men and women who could translate her hands into language. One such person was Lucas, a graduate student who had a boy's hunger and a woman's compassion. He came from a modest background, one that had taught him to seek light in small things. He listened to Mira, and then sat late into the nights with her, translating her reflections into formal steps. They argued over notation like two tailors arguing over a pattern, measuring twice, cutting once. Your reflections force a tile into a forced neighbor, Lucas said one night, tapping a pen against his pad. If we can encode those reflections as group actions and show the forced edge property persists under iteration, then the local construction extends. The proof, at its heart, is combinatorial. They worked. Nights blurred into mornings. Nadia brought coffee in thermoses and a kind of comic relief. The cameras kept a faint, ignoring presence, a suburban press that had already decided the story and was looking for a neat end. The Institute, which preferred control, found itself undone by something raw and real. But backstage, not all were willing to be undone. Dean Raines gathered a committee to test whether accepting Mira's method would diminish the Institute's status. The truth was plain: acceptance would mean admitting that brilliance could arise from places and practices outside the Institute's hallowed corridors. For him, the problem was not mathematics, it was narrative. He called in lawyers, wrote drafts, and sought technicalities. One morning, when Lucas and Mira had nearly convinced a small cluster of faculty that extending the reflection schema worked, an op-ed broke in a national paper. The headline accused the Institute of orchestrating a publicity stunt, suggested that Mira's tile had been seeded by insiders. The writer, a familiar voice from the world of spectacle, claimed that the Institute's optics couldn't be trusted. Readers liked conspiracies. Conspiracies were easy to swallow. Mira felt the attack like a hand on her collar. She had no legal defense. She had a patch of tiles and a friend with a pen. The articles became a chorus. Some called her a charlatan. A few called the reporters unkind names. The Institute denied knowledge, which was a strange theater of denials. Dean Raines looked vindicated by public skepticism, the familiar armor of the offended institution. Elias, in contrast, became a quiet and steady ally who did not care about his past honors. He began to speak in op-eds himself, not as defense, but as nudison. He wrote about method and witness, about how exposure breeds insight, and how disciplines that barricade themselves often deteriorate into their own monologues. His writing carried an old professor's tenderness and was not gossipy. It was an appeal to the discipline's better angels. When the committee finally convened to deliberate, the air was thick with 1,000 little obligations. Lucas presented a draft proof that extended Mira's patch by showing a recurrence. Each reflection forced a neighbor in such a way that the local non-periodicity could be preserved at larger scales. The proof was careful, legible, and, to a mathematician, beautiful. The room was quiet in a way that was not merely courtesy. Then Dean Raines stood. "The proof is interesting," he said. He spoke in the tone of a man who liked to deliver verdicts like currency. "But the Institute must consider its legacy. A full acceptance means we will have to change our calls for problems. It will mean our donors will ask different questions. We cannot force the world to change for a woman who cannot recite a lemma." It was a line of reasoning dressed as pragmatism. It was also a malevolent little quarrel with reality. Mira, who had a life of bills and customers and children who came with hemmed knees, felt something like an old wound sharpen. Elias rose then, with the calm of the river he loved. "You propose protecting an institution by protecting its ignorance," he said. "If that is what the Institute seeks, then perhaps we are in the wrong business. Our job is to open doors, not to keep them." Mira's construction is not a publicity event. It is an invitation to reason together. And if your donors prefer illusion, Then we will find donors who prefer truth. The room whispered. Some faces reddened. The trustees looked like men who had been asked to pay for an updated map of the world. The committee voted. It was a narrow margin, and the institution, which was always more frightened than it wanted to admit, chose a compromise. It would not deny the construction. It would not award the prize immediately. Instead, it would commission a formal panel to vet the proof and decide on recognition. For some in the room, that decision read like justice. For others, it read like postponement. Postponement was, in many ways, the institution's favored form of death. Mira did not want the prize. She wanted to be heard and to continue her life. She had thought she would return to her shop and that the world would be as familiar as the grain of cloth. But the story would not let her be private. The television cameras painted her as Myth the seamstress who solved the impossible. Children in the neighborhood began to call out her name and show up with little puzzles. A small cluster of activists used her story to question systemic gatekeeping. They organized lectures in the community center about geometry and measuring and using one's hands as instruments. She grew wary of the praise that smelled like an instrument for others. Public stardom had the same feel as a badly threaded needle. It tugged in the wrong direction. One evening, after a day of interviews that had pried at her life like two hands at a seam, Mira returned to the tailor's shop to find her mother at the sewing machine, humming, as if nothing had happened. The simplicity of the scene steadied her. "You did it," her mother said, not much else, but with a kind of pride that had the warmth of bread. "You made things fit." Mira sat with her and let the word echo fit. She had always equated fit with safety, with a way of making the world less tearing and more habitable. The prize, the public debates, the boardroom arguments, they were all variations on whether the world would fit its pieces into somebody's preferred picture. Then, an email came from a small charity that taught children from poor neighborhoods how to read and do math. They asked, would she lead a workshop? Could she show kids how patterns worked? Could she teach the practice of seeing? Mira thought of the sewing machine, of the small hands of the boy who measured his own height with a tape in the shop, of the girl who had once, at a bus stop, asked if she could learn to sew. The idea of teaching was a thread she had not followed before. It called to her because it seemed honest. She accepted. The workshop was in a cramped community room with posters of planets peeling at the corners. The children came with sticky fingers and wide eyes. Mira had no notes. She started with cloth, with paper squares and the simple instruction: make them fit. They folded and mirrored and reflected like an untrained chorus. The magic was in the hands. The children adjusted, tried, failed, and then triumphantly found a piece that fit. They shouted, Nadia told her later, and Mira pictured the small triumphs like moths of light. She also felt, in her own chest, the old quiet of work that meant something beyond spectacle. Months passed. The Institute's formal review continued with the steady rhythm of academic machinery. Papers were written. Conferences debated the classification of the tiling. The city grew used to seeing Mira's name paired with words that previously meant nothing to her. The world's appetite for drama cooled into a steady interest, then settled. Finally, the Institute called a formal symposium to present a full paper that extended Mira's patch into a full proof. Lucas and several faculty members had combined combinatorial arguments with geometric group actions to provide rigorous steps. Elias had written a beautiful introduction that read like a love letter to curiosity. The final document, when published, did more than validate a construction. It invited a different way of thinking about how craft and theory intersected. At the symposium, Dean Raines read the board's statement: recognition would be given where recognition was merited. The words were careful, but the substance was clear. The Institute would acknowledge the contribution, and an endowed chair would be established to study the intersection of craft, applied problem-solving, and formal theory. When the applause came, Myra felt it like a wind across an open field. She did not stand on a pedestal. She stood in front of a whiteboard and used chalk the way she had used pins, with patience and attention. She told the audience what she had seen. She spoke about collars and sleeves and the necessity of matching edges. She told them not to be afraid of the hand's knowledge and not to make a temple of exclusivity. Afterwards, people came to the room in small, awkward clusters. Some wanted autographs. Some wanted to argue about notation. A woman approached Mira with tears in her eyes. "My daughter," she said, voice thick. She always felt her hands were wrong for math. "You showed her hands are not the wrong kind of mind." Elias smiled from the back of the room, like old weather returning. "Wood did not invent you," he told the audience gently. "Wood bore witness." Yet the ending was not a tidy triumph. Dean Raines resigned months later, not in scandal, but in the understandable way of institutions that prefer narratives to truth. A new director arrived who had the quiet of someone who liked to build rather than preserve. The endowed chair flourished. The children's workshops expanded and were funded by a coalition of donors who liked the optics of humility and truth. Mira continued to sue. She used a portion of the funds from small honors to renovate the community center. She bought new machines, brought in materials, and hired a few apprentices. The work was slow, necessary. In the morning she still woke to the same light, and the city still smelled of fruit and diesel and possibility. When the cameras returned, they came back to the city with new stories of integration and redemption. She let them film once and then politely refused further appearances. One day, a small bronze plaque appeared at the Institute's entrance. It read, simply in a crisp serif, "Ian Heno Rof Tausem Mopak Sai Entothory." The plaque was small, and it fit like a patch on the institution's grandfather. At the end of everything, Mira measured the hem of a wedding dress for a girl who would walk down an aisle with a man she loved. The girl laughed as Mira pinned the fabric, the sound like a bell. Myra thought then of the public spectacle and of the quiet of the machine and considered the strange arithmetic of life, how small everyday actions add up, fold into each other, reveal patterns, and sometimes, improbably, undeniably, solve a problem everyone said was impossible. She had become, in the eyes of the papers, a symbol. But she was, in the most useful way, unchanged a woman whose hands knew how to make the world fit better. In 47 seconds she had shifted a cathedral's light. In the years after, she stitched a city into a more honest garment. It was, she thought as she sued, the truest kind of solution, quiet, patient, and held together by thread,